Hello, and welcome to Carcassonne, set deep in the heart of southern rural France. The jewel of the Languedoc, you join me here, outside its main gate, the Porte Narbonnaise. So called, but exactly ahead of me lies the ancient town of Narbonne, the first Roman port developed outside of Italy, and the town the Romans had declared their provincial capital. Before we enter the city, first we will explore the ramparts. Come on, follow me. Here we are, up on the ramparts. From here, you can see why the town was built here. We have a glorious view over the surrounding countryside, and with the River Aude just below us, the city's first settlers had not just fresh water, but also a solid natural line of defence. Before we continue our tour, however, first we need some background to be able to truly appreciate this great city.
Carcassonne started life as what the Celts called an oppidum, a fortified hilltop town overlooking the vast Languedoc countryside and the mighty River Aude in approximately 3500 BC. Given the name Carsac, its buildings would have been made from earth and wood, and its inhabitants, predominantly farmers and traders who would have travelled into the valley beyond, as well as the Black Mountains to the north and the Pyrenees to the west, assembled here to buy and sell their wares. These ranged from sheep's fleeces, crops and timber, and even ice, which was carried down the mountains during the winter, wrapped in straw, and then buried in large holes in the ground called ice houses, for storage during the warm summer months. However, trouble was brewing. The year was 52 BC, and Caesar had just dealt an enormous blow to the Gallic forces and claimed victory at Alesia. The Romans were coming. At this time, the area where Carcassonne stands today was on the frontier between Spain and France. The Romans had made Narbonne their capital of the province and built a fort here at Carcassonne to protect the border. Whereas the Celts built their forts, houses and public buildings from wood, the Romans built theirs from stone.
Here behind me, you can see some of those original Roman walls. We are able to distinguish the remains of the Roman city here, as the walls were constructed with lines of red brick. Much like the stripes on the body of a poisonous animal, the message was clear: danger, keep away.
In the 5th century AD, after a number of defeats from enemy forces, the Roman Empire was on the brink of collapse. The latest in a string of attacks was from the Visigoths, a Germanic tribe that had settled north of the Loire in western France. Adding to the equation were the Ostrogoths, who were pushing deeper into Roman territories from the east. When the two met, the Goths pushed down into the south of France, eventually expanding their enormous kingdoms into Spain and Italy, while the Vandals occupied North Africa. A barbaric tribe, the Visigoths pillaged and looted wherever they went, and, upon arriving at Carcassonne, were able to take control of the city. In 462, the Romans officially ceded Septimania to the Visigoth king Theodoric II, who had held Carcassonne since 453. They extended the city walls and demolished the temple, instead constructing a pagan church on the site in the 6th century AD. In 508, the Visigoths successfully foiled numerous attacks by the Frankish king Clovis I. After the Visigoth reign, the Moors occupied this part of southern France. A nomadic people, they originated in northern Africa, in the present-day countries of Morocco and Algeria. The Umayyad dynasty quickly swept across the whole of the Arab states, and then leapt into the Iberian Peninsula and Spain in the 8th century, which they occupied for more than 800 years. With a mind to expand the empire further, the Moors crossed the Pyrenees and into France. They reached as far north as Paris, but were pushed back over the Pyrenees by the Frankish king, Pepin le Bref, or Pepin the Short. During their brief 40-year occupation of southern France, they came here to Carcassonne, and some examples of Moorish architecture can still be seen in the city. Over the subsequent centuries, Carcassonne bore witness to some great Frankish dynasties, the most famous of which was that of the Trencavel family. In the early 13th century, Raymond Roger Trencavel, Viscount of Béziers and Lord of Carcassonne, sheltered a number of religious heretics, today best known as Cathars. Originating from the city of Albi, they were officially known as Albigensians, and the popularity of this new religion was growing fast. Cathars were Christian, but had different sets of beliefs to the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholic Church were deeply worried, and in 1209, Pope Innocent III launched a crusade to help rid France of the heresy. The Albigensian Crusade, as it was to be known, was the only crusade to take place in mainland Europe, as well as the only one in which Christians were persecuted. After besieging and sacking the city of Vivre in July 1209, in which many were killed, Pope Innocent III appointed a knight, Simon de Montfort, in charge of leading the crusade, and a month later the army arrived at Carcassonne. The city was besieged for 6 weeks, with Simon de Montfort waiting for the town to surrender. After negotiating with the Catholic leaders of the crusade, Raymond Roger secured the safety of the inhabitants of Carcassonne, including the lives of the Cathars. He, however, was thrown into his own dungeon and starved to death, while Simon de Montfort appointed himself Viscount of Carcassonne and added to the fortifications defending the city. He was eventually killed some 10 years later while engaging in the siege of Toulouse, and was buried here in the Basilica at Carcassonne. The Middle Ages were a relatively peaceful time for the people of Carcassonne. Louis IX, later Saint Louis, came to the city and extended the defences by building the outer curtain wall, digging a moat and constructing more gatehouses and watchtowers, bringing the total to 52. Seeing that the population was fast growing inside the citadel, he started work on a new town across the river. However, during the 100 Years' War against the English, the town was destroyed. During a series of conflicts against the Spanish and the Dutch in the early 17th century, France began to interfere with Spanish politics by aiding a revolt in Catalonia, and so Spain retaliated by helping the French engaging in the Fronde, a period of violence throughout the country in 1648. During negotiations for the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, France gained the Sundgau and cut off Spanish access to the Netherlands from Austria, leading to open warfare between the French and the Spanish. After 23 years of war, an Anglo-French alliance was victorious at the Battle of the Dunes in June 1658, but the following year the war ground to a halt when the French campaign to take Milan was defeated. Peace was settled by means of the Treaty of the Pyrenees in November 1659. As well as gaining parts of Luxembourg, Artois and other towns in Flanders, France gained Roussillon, meaning that Carcassonne lost its once important strategic location, and the border with Spain was fixed at the Pyrenees. The city's fortifications were soon abandoned, and its inhabitants, attracted by the newer accommodation of the finished new town, slowly began to leave. In the 18th century, the city was in a desperate state of disrepair. Roofs were falling in, the walls and towers were starting to collapse.
In 1849, the French government declared that the city was to be demolished. Of course, a petition was started by the local population, who were outraged that, although in serious need of repair, the ancient city that watched over them could disappear altogether. Enough signatures were obtained that, in 1853, the government had to go back on their word and set in charge of the restoration an architect, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. Viollet-le-Duc had been responsible for the safekeeping and much of the cultural and architectural heritage of France, and Carcassonne was to be his biggest project yet. Unfortunately, much of his work was criticised during his lifetime, and long after his time it is still looked at with a sense of anguish. Rather than rebuilding the city sensitively, he chose an economical and efficient approach, preferring to use modern building materials and techniques, meaning that the stones and buildings he restored can be very clearly identified. Behind me, you can see one of the gatehouses. The stones are similar to what we know today as brise block, and the roofs of the towers he has installed are slates, as opposed to the traditional tiles which would have once adorned them. Still, if it wasn't for Viollet-le-Duc, we would not have Carcassonne today, and his additions just add to the wealth of history that make this city so very unique. Despite his lack of sensitivity to the site, UNESCO appointed Carcassonne as a World Heritage Site in 1997, meaning that today it is protected for us and for future generations to enjoy. I think that's enough background history for now. Let's make our way inside and explore the city. As we make our way inside, you can see that it is an actual city in here, not just a castle. There are half-timbered houses, shops and restaurants, There are even hotels in the city. The streets are paved with beautiful cobbled stones, some of which still bear the marks of hundreds of years of carts and wagons which have rumbled their way along the streets. The first highlight of the city of Carcassonne which I would like to show you is this, the Château Comtal. It was built in the 12th century by the Trencavel family and was absorbed into part of the Roman walls of the town and was defended by a drawbridge and a moat. This was the inner sanctum where the rich and powerful of Carcassonne could be protected during attacks to the city. The wooden balconies which you can see abutting the walls are called hoardings. Quickly erected in times of war, they allowed the defending garrison of the castle and of the city to have a better line of defence and line of sight when faced with the enemy. Holes, called murder holes, would have been cut into the floor of the hoarding, allowing the army to throw things directly onto the army below, preventing them from gaining access to the walls or gatehouses. Now, it's a bit of an urban myth that boiling oil would have been thrown overboard, as it was an amenity, it was expensive, and would have been wastewater to discard. They did, however, throw rocks, boiling water, and sometimes even animals, albeit a little bit Monty Python style, to deter the enemy from getting too close. Now, there's a funny story I would like to tell you that involves throwing animals off the walls of the city, the legend of how Carcassonne got its name.
You have to imagine, the Moors are still occupying this corner of southern France. The Saracen king, Abd-el-Rahman, has been killed at the Battle of Tours, and so his widow was left in charge of Carcassonne. Her name was Lady, or Dame, Carcas. The great Frankish king, Charlemagne, had been besieging the city for 6 years, waiting for the town to run out of food and water. The citadel, though self-sufficient with its farms and ample water supply from its 2 wells, was starting to struggle. It had been a long, hot summer, and plants and animals were suffering, and the people were hungry. Not giving up all hope, Dame Carcas came up with an ingenious plan. She told her people to find the youngest piglet and to feed it with the best grain and the best water the city had left, and to report back to her once it was fattened. The people were starving and, despite their religious beliefs, were excited to feast on the pig they had fattened. They showed the pig to Dame Carcas and she announced her plan. The army was to throw the pig over the walls down to the army below. The people were, it has to be said, a little sad that they had to throw their pig to Charlemagne's army, but they did as they were told and tossed it over the ramparts. Below them, Charlemagne's army were faced with the mangled carcass of a pig, and were shocked that the Moors would throw away such a good pig. "Wow," they exclaimed, "these people have so much food that they are willing to throw us the scraps. We're never going to break them." And with that, they started to pack up their tents and weapons and head away from the siege. Dame Carcas and the inhabitants of Carcassonne were so happy that they had defeated the Franks that they rang every bell in the town. In the distance, Charlemagne's army turned to him and said, "Listen, Carcassonne, Carcassonne, Carcas is calling." And that is the legend of how Carcassonne got its name.
Behind me here is one of my favourite buildings in the whole of the city. Other than being very beautiful, it also tells a very important story. You can see that it is jetted, meaning that the ground floor is a lot narrower than the upper floor. Now, there's a very important reason for this, and I'll give you a couple of seconds to guess what it might be. Do you know? I'll tell you. In the Middle Ages, citizens were taxed on how many metres squared they built on, and so, to avoid taxes associated with having a larger house, the builders would extend the upper story, meaning that the footprint of a building did not exceed the maximum size. This also gave way to the added bonus that it's a lot easier to throw one's waste from the top floor onto the street. As you may be able to see, the streets are ever so slightly concave, and in the Middle Ages, there would have been an open sewer running through the town as people emptied their waste onto the road. It would have been disgusting. And it is from this that we get the gallantry for a man to walk on the outside of the pavement, so if there was a splash, he would get the brunt of it, and his lady friend should get away scot-free. Now I also want to draw your attention to this building, the ancient palace of the Archbishop, now a fancy hotel. If you take a look at the roof, beneath it you will see a line of decorative tiles. on the facade of a building. This was a way of showing everyone how wealthy you were, a status symbol if you will. Now, as this was the Archbishop's palace, he was very wealthy and so could afford to have 3 rows of tiles. A shopkeeper or merchant who made a good living could maybe afford to have 1 or 2, whereas the average Joe probably didn't have any at all. Occasionally, you will see sculptures of saints or other religious figures on private dwellings in French medieval cities. This was another way of evading taxes, as it was believed that you had the protection of the saint, and so you would be exempt. Of course, it was simply another way of the church making more money, and so you had to pay for the luxury. But, as you can imagine, once a family had this protection from the church, and most importantly from the taxman, they would have kept the house in the family for generations. Now, if you turn around, you will see the final part of our tour, the Basilica. Here we are, standing in front of the Basilica of San Jose and San Cels. As I have mentioned, the Visigoths built a pagan church on this site in the 6th century AD, some of which can still be seen on the far right. The church was absorbed into a Carolingian cathedral, of which no traces remain today. The Basilica as we see it today, however, was first constructed under the reign of the Trencavel family in the 11th century, when Pope Urban II travelled to Carcassonne to bless the building materials. Made from granite, as opposed to the traditional limestone, it was built in the Romanesque style. However, the siege of Simon de Montfort in 1209 temporarily halted work. Construction started again in 1269, this time in the Gothic style, and was finished in 1330, after which it was attributed to Saint Nazaire and Saint Cels, 2 early Christian preachers in Gaul who were martyred by the Romans. The Cathedral of Saint Nazaire and Saint Cels remained so until 1803, when it lost its title to the present-day Cathedral of St. Michael in the New Town, which had been constructed under the reign of St. Louis. So, shall we enter? Here we are, inside the Basilica. As you can see behind me, there is a beautiful marriage between the early Romanesque nave and the later Gothic choir. We're standing in the oldest part of the Basilica, and some of the walls and pillars that surround us formed part of that early Visigoth church.
Behind us is what is reputed to be the oldest working organ in France. Built in 1522 and, though it has been rebuilt and remodelled over the centuries, the core has remained original, meaning only classical music can be played on it.
As you may have noticed, the whole building is lit in this spectacular colour from its glorious stained glass windows, which are original and date from the 13th and 14th centuries. The central window in the choir behind me dates from 1280 and depicts the life of Jesus Christ in 16 medallions and is one of the oldest windows of its kind in the south of France. The 2 windows either side of the transept align with the rising and setting sun. The north rose window, when lit with the rising sun, shimmers with the symphony of violets and blues, giving the impression of the dawn, whereas the south window sparkles with majestic reds and yellows of the sunset. Set back in the corner of the church, here you can see the remains of the tomb of Simon de Montfort, who was buried here following his death at the siege of Toulouse in 1218. His body was later exhumed to be laid to rest at the monastery of Aude River, which was founded by the Montfort family in 1114 to the west of Paris. Beside his tombstone hangs the siege stone, part of a frieze that chronicled the Albigensian Crusade and which depicts his death at the siege of Toulouse. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed my tour of the city de Carcassonne, and I look forward to welcoming you back next time as we explore the mysterious and intriguing history of Chablis and discover its beautiful wines.